Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson,
I'm Carson Grubaugh. This is Living the Line.
and with us today is someone you might know, your friend and mine, Ryan Holmberg. Ryan, what do you go by these days? What's your title?
My job description.
Yeah, give us the long title.
Oh, just usually manga, comics historian, and translator is usually what I use.
Excellent. I've been
Wow.
reading stuff that you've translated for a long time. I think the first time that I saw something by you was probably those first few Comics Journal pieces that you did, which were really fantastic. Was that back in 2010? I think.
Probably 2010, 2011. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so is that the first writing about comics that you ever did, or you've been writing?
First published stuff. Oh, let's see. No, a little bit before that. I was one or two academic things in academic journals. And then I wrote something for, I'm trying to remember the timeline. I wrote something for Dan Nadell for his old blog or his old webpage, Comics Comics,
Right.
and some other things. I mean, other than that, I had written a little bit about contemporary art, like reviews and stuff, because I came out of an art history background and was
Okay.
into contemporary art. But comics, I think the first thing I published was in IJOCA, the International Journal of Comic Art, run by John Lent. And
Gotcha.
then I published something about the Gado artist Sasaki Maki in an academic journal called Japan Forum. But then Dan Nadell was um, editor at TCJ.com at that point. So he asked me to start writing for them, and that's how that started, and that spun out to working with him on picture box books.
Right. And so that was your first professional translated work, was those first few Picture Box volumes, like the Tezuka book and the follow up.
The Sugiura book was first,
Oh,
but
okay. Well,
before that, the Sugiura Last of the Mohicans. But before that, Dan asked me to actually be involved in some of the Yokoyama Yuichi projects he was doing. I think Garden. He wasn't. He had some questions about the translation that someone else had submitted. So I think I went over that and changed a few things.
right.
And then he also did. I can't remember the chronology. I think this was before the Mohicans book, but Yokoyama Yuichi has this not so well known work called Color Engineering,
Okay.
not New Engineering, but Color Engineering, and it was co-published, if I'm not mistaken, between Dan and Yokoyama's gallery in one of his galleries in Japan, in Tokyo. So I did the translation for that. So I think those were the first two things. And then Dan wanted to set up a series or two with me. So the two series were the alt manga series, which only had one volume, the Hayashi Seiichi's Gold Pollen, and then the 10-cent manga series, which was Mohicans, and then the Tezuka book. And then Dan quit Picture Box. So both of those series ended very abruptly. So we had one more book contracted, and I think like two more books kind of in the hopper at that point.
So in we're 12 years later now, and it seems like this year you're really coming back full circle to a lot of the things that you started off at the beginning of your translation career. I mean, you've announced obviously Living the Line has an edition of the new Yokoyama book coming out, which we've got a Kickstarter going for right now, which is Plaza, and then you are also translating a new book. Or a new work by I'm sorry, Sugihiro, is that how you say his last name?
Shige Tadao or Yoshiharu, both the brothers. I'm working on books by both the brothers right now.
Gotcha. Um, so do, how do you make the transition from writing about comics to translating comics? I mean, obviously you've got a linguistic background that would accommodate something like.
So I did a PhD in art history, Japanese art history, and ended up writing about Gado, 1960s Gado, early 70s Gado. So you know, translation for me was basically a way to, I felt like a lot of the stuff, it was, if it's interesting enough to write about, it's probably also worth translating a lot of it. Some comics, if you just see one or two panels or pages, it probably suffices for knowing what it is. But there is so much interesting manga, obviously, and that, if one is going to write about it in a historical or theoretical way, then might as well also translate it, especially if you have the connections to do so. So, and the other thing is, it was very clear to me that it wouldn't be that easy to get a stable academic job doing comics. So I needed a paid platform to do that. So it seemed to me that doing the translations and then putting my essays and historical essays into the translations was a good package, because the essays alone, I could not get paid much or anything for them. But to use the platform of the translations, I was at least using the translations as an excuse to get the essays published in a way. I mean, of course, that's kind of, in some ways, it's become kind of a bad model for me in some ways, because, most of the projects I work on, the essays end up taking up, anywhere from twice to 10 times as much time as all the other work. So I'm trying at this point to take on less projects that also require essays and just do translations, because that's where I get more of the money from. And it's exhausting to. The other thing is, you're working with different publishers and people different timelines. It's not like you can write one essay and then write a second essay on a related topic and then a third essay. You can't keep that momentum going. Each project is usually discrete. And even if there is kind of talk about some kind of sequel, it may or may not happen. It probably won't happen for a year or two down the road. So, even with the Tsugeyoshi Haru series doing now with D&Q, we're going to be working on volume 3 this summer. There's about a year or a year and a half between each one. So, working on so many different things. I don't have an awesome memory to begin with. So every time it's basically restarting from scratch, trying to remember things. So yeah, if I had my way, I would just take a year and do all 6 volumes, but it just doesn't work out that way. So it's a lot of work to stop and then get back going and get the whole map of who, what, where, when back in your head.
Are you engaged with academia at all, or have you just moved out of that and said, I have a better venue for this? Because you're saying, I don't.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
No, I'm in touch with academia in different ways. The main way is now, the main way over the years was short-term teaching gigs and research grants. I've been very blessed over the years for having very lucrative research grants, both from inside the United States and from Japanese institutions. But that's not happening anymore, but I still teach. Right now, I teach online courses about the history of manga for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago.
Okay.
So that came along last year. And it came along somewhat nepotistically. I'm not going to say I'm not qualified for the job, but a friend of mine, an old friend of mine from grad school era, he became chair of the department. So he wanted someone to teach classes that would definitely have students, and he knew that history of manga would definitely draw students. So I taught 2 classes for them this past year, and this coming year I'm teaching 3 courses for them.
Nice.
And it's per course, in terms of how many hours I put into actually teaching, it's good pay, but you only teach 1 day a week. So, but at least it provides a baseline of income, because all the translation, the freelance writing and translation stuff, especially if your pay is somewhat based off of sales and royalties, you don't know how much a project is going to be worth to you, nor when it's actually going to be published and when you're going to get paid. So it's good to have at least a regular paycheck, even if it's not that substantial.
Yeah. I'm just curious because I'm also in higher education, and I'm always interested in watching people who find like a better venue, or like people moving, like you said, okay, my essays are going to do better, they're going to be more relevant
I
in
don't.
these
Yeah, I
books.
mean, better like red. People like them is much different than them making money for me.
Yeah,
You know, the writing. I'm starting to get paid more now for the essays I'm writing, but it's also because I'm working for slightly bigger publishers, like New York Review of Comics, who has it's like a they have money because they're related to New York Review of Books. So, you know, they can pay more. But yeah, but in terms of just like time put in to what I'm getting paid for the essay, it's peanuts. It's really pennies on the hour.
but you wouldn't get paid at all as academia. You'd be under the gun of like, if you're not getting these published, you're losing your job. So
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's like grass is always greener, but there is something to be said to be, you know, um have your income based on your teaching and your
yeah,
administrative work and academia and for an academic job, and then be quote unquote free to write what you want to write about or
yeah,
in a way that you want to write about. And of course, writing for academia has its own restrictions and frustrations. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's like a give and take. I think once you're in it for a while in academia, you learn how to write in a way for that context that satisfies you. And I guess one thing is like once you're in that system, though, you end up writing like an academic all the time and kind of end up writing in a very restricted way. Um, you know, and what I was doing, and I think this applies to most people writing about comics, you realize that unlike other fields in the humanities, that probably 90% of your readers aren't don't have anything to do with academia. So it's unlike contemporary art, writing about contemporary art or art history, where probably 90% of the people who are going to read your stuff are either museum world people or art world people or
hmm,
academic art history people. So you end up writing to those people who have very specific, I don't know, even class interests that are very different than I think the people who read about comics. So yeah, I also realized like you know like in with comics, it's like there's also like especially with manga, there's like a one can write about topics in different ways. One can write in a historical way. One can write in a theoretical way, right? But like you know, a field also has its own internal chronology in the sense that I realized a lot because when you're in grad school, there's a lot of pressure to write really theoretically astute and smart sounding things and incisive things, like do readings of texts, right? And I respect that when it's done well. I respect people who do that well. I realized that I probably wasn't all that great at doing it. I could do it okay, but not wonderfully in the context of academia. But I also realized that, you know, even in Japanese, the historiography of manga is not that well developed. So it became very clear to me that step one to establish this history, especially in English, was to write just intelligible, concrete history, right? And you know, doing the translation is kind of part of that, right? It's like before we start doing really big-headed things about the history of manga or what manga is, we first need to kind of set groundwork of like baseline history, chronologies, and then get kind of the basic the foundational works out into translation. So it seemed like the field itself had a chronology. We had to do the first things first before we started getting too ahead of ourselves and doing the big headed things.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the things that's frustrating about like one of the founding texts of, you know, a book that Carson and I have referred to a lot is Fred Schott's Manga, which is, you know, unbelievable that came out of nowhere and, you know, obviously incredibly influential, but it's also incredibly frustrating because it's like, okay, here's one photocopied panel from
Yeah,
the comic, and, you know, it's this totally loaded image, and here's a 2 second sentence description underneath it, and they allude to this guy having drawn 12,000 more pages, and that's all you get, you know. And it's like
yeah,
if you don't have the language skills, it's like it's an entire world completely
sure.
able to you. It boggles my mind that people talk about the comics canon and things like that when what they're actually looking at is such a small cross section of the world outside there, outside the window. It's a really myopic kind of view until
Sure.
you, like you said, you've assembled the chronology and you've
Yeah.
assembled pieces and you can actually take a look at it. Um, I should phrase that as a question, I suppose.
Well, there's a extension of that at least where, and it could lead to a question, because Sean has been exposing me to the works that you've translated. I'm getting a different view of the chronology of comics, and it's something we've come back to a lot on this channel, that I continue to be like, holy shit, like we all celebrate Will Eisner's Contract of God for being this like packaged finished unit, and then we're looking at some of these works that you translated that are done, before that
Sure.
are way better,
Yeah.
and we've been missing that view. So I'm curious, when you're looking at these works, what is the criteria for what you're trying to bring over, and what are you trying to establish in terms of that overall global picture of comics, and who got to where at what point?
I mean, it really depends. I mean, in the beginning, it was just like, I have this. Okay, I will say at some point in the past, probably in the past 5 years, it did occur to me like I should aim at getting these. What are the most historically important 20 manga, 20 most historically important manga? And when I'm saying this, I'm like thinking about the before the 1980s, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that other publishers, bigger publishers, will take care of this stuff from the 80s and 90s up to the present. There's a larger market for that, right? So publishers like Kodansha and Viz and historically like Vertical, they will get that stuff out over time, right? So it's like, who's going to take care of the stuff that's earlier, that doesn't necessarily have as large of a market? And publishers affiliated with Japanese big publishing houses won't necessarily themselves be compelled to excavate and publish that stuff, right? So within that context, like what are like the 20 most historically important manga that should be brought over? So that did occur to me at some point, and then kind of like the list is always changing, but it's also hampered by a number of factors. The biggest one would be, can I license it or not as an individual, or as an individual working with a smaller, medium-sized publisher? Because a lot of the big titles in manga history, even going back to the 1960s, are more or less overseen by big publishing houses.
Right.
So, like Kodansha, it has Kodansha USA, and Viz has Shueisha and Shogakukan, which published Shonen Jump and other big magazines. So any artists that historically were primarily working for those publishers, Kodansha USA and Viz is going to have dibs on that content, right? So most of those artists, I know it's probably hard for me to license them for a different publisher. There are exceptions to this, but I know that it's probably going to be more difficult. And there's also there's like certain Tezuka works that I've tried repeatedly to get licensed, but his estate is overseen by Tezuka Productions, and there are certain works from Tezuka's past, particularly early in his career,
Right.
that Tezuka Production is not comfortable with releasing outside of Japan, mostly because of racist caricatures in them, is the main concern. So, I've asked them numerous times if I could license the first version of New Treasure Island, which is his breakout work in, was it 47?
Right.
And then also Jungle Emperor, which, other people have also tried to license, but they've said no repeatedly.
It's
So, it's like
something like Jungle Emperor isn't available. I mean, it skews your entire view of what happened when and why. When this is a formative work for comics internationally, not just this island.
I mean, they're the last time I asked them, which was about 6 months ago. They had a new guy, and I think like the new guy didn't know all the PC things to say, but he told me straight out that it was about representation of Africans in the manga, right? I think that, I don't know, like I should know this, but I don't. I think also historically there's maybe some kind of deal they had with Disney about trying to limit that getting out, but I don't really know. But anyway, I think the main concern is the other one about racist caricatures in it.
Mm.
But then what else is, what are the other, then the other hindrance, of course, is can you find someone in English to publish it? And even if you can, will it make enough money to even be worth your time, right? And in the past, I've taken on a lot of projects that, I really wanted to do, and even if they make me very little money, but I'm getting to the point now where just kind of like overworked and just can't do that anymore. So I need to do lesser projects, and just focus more on projects that make me a little bit more money at this point. So yeah.
I'm curious about the problem of the Viz and Kodansha having like dibs on things, because it seems like even if they don't want to publish it, you still can't get it. It's like if they decide no, then it's just a no-go. What is the logic behind that for them?
I don't know the exact, I really don't know, because I don't work for either the American companies or the Japanese companies. So I don't know what the actual internal discussions are like. I mean, I think they see that, the manga market is growing, so they might as well hold on to that stuff. It's been probably more beneficial to them than hold on to it for 5 years than to license it for very little to someone else. Right.
You can see some of their marketing strategy in that. I mean, they piloted somebody like Rumiko Takahashi, I mean, 2 or 3 times before she stuck, and now she's a superstar in the United States. But they did these little pilots of her
Sure.
stuff, and they didn't just dive right in. It's not like they just went
Yeah.
straight to like licensing Ranma, and that was the first thing that came out. And what I've heard from other publishers is that certain artists can be appealed to directly, even if they're under those banners, but that you are likely going to be paying a premium for the licensing if it's going through the other company. And
what other company? The agency?
Exactly, but the rights holders and might exact a toll
Right.
for that. And you're already talking about really tight margins on publishing on this size. Making that even tighter is just basically impossible if it's a marginal work, or even if you think it might be big with the right marketing, but you're adding more money each time you add one of these things, and the next thing you know, you got a huge pile of money you're going to spend on something that might sell 1,000 copies. Which
right. I mean, the other thing is also like artwork that's ready to go, ready to publish. It's like you run I mean, you know this better than I do, but like even working with Japan, it's like there's a certain number of patterns you see, and that is, even if a book, like a reprint of something, was published as recently as like 2005, maybe even 2010, I don't know. Like sometimes publishers won't even have that data. They'll say that they've lost the data, or it was done on film or something like that. So it's just like, first of all, you have to gauge how much time and effort it is going to create the data for producing the artwork. And sometimes Japanese companies, especially bigger companies, they'll charge you an arm and a leg for the data on top of everything else. So, these are all factors. So, it's like, ideally you want to work kind of the best way is kind of work directly with the artist or the heirs. But oftentimes that means that you have to, create the data yourself, which is a whole nother layer of labor.
Right. So one of the things that's fairly intriguing to me, having mainlined a bunch of your stuff that I had never read in the past couple months, was how different each project is. And I think that Plaza, once again, we got a Kickstarter live right now. You can pre-order your copy. Plaza is fairly dramatically different from most of the manga out there, but also fairly dramatically different from a translation perspective. I mean, can you walk me through, like, you and I went back and forth a lot about I mean, just from a visual perspective, when you told me you wanted to do this book, Ryan, I was looking at it and I was like, how in the world do you localize these effects?
Oh
I was
yeah,
imagining like, doing hand lettering in English to mimic this. And, it would be totally impossible without reversing the page because, of course, you have the flow.
sure.
The flow is going wrong. It would be the words would have to be backwards in order to accommodate the flow of the page and everything. And we ended up settling on this, unobtrusive sort of subtitle uh,
Yeah.
approach. So how does a work like Plaza differ from other translated works, or like a text heavy work like Boat Life or something like that you're working on now?
Oh, I mean, I think, I mean, I think quote unquote translating anything by Yokoyama is quite easy. The only, I mean, for me, it's like I mean, it's just sound effects, right? Um, I guess the only thing that's a little bit difficult is just making sure you have some consistency when you're repeating sound effects across the book. But even there, because Japanese, the phonetic range is much narrower than say in English, that you'll have the same set of katakana, Japanese, describing a wide variety of things.
Right.
So which would have different sounds, different alphabetic constructions, combinations in English. So
Carson,
it's
will you
just kind
show
of
us that?
keeping track of stuff like that. But
Will you show us that first page there, Carson? The Goro Goro Goro.
yeah,
This is one of my favorites. This is one of the things that cracked me up about this. You have to live with these sounds through the entire book
yeah,
because of the nature of the work, and so it seems like picking them out was particularly important. We kind of managed to avoid the sort of cartoony effects,
hmm,
and you really leaned into the more onomatopoeic characteristics where that sound effect has probably never appeared in English before, and yet somebody has a really good idea that you're talking about rolling out mats or whatever.
right,
um,
yeah, yeah.
so I mean, is that something that you did? I remember there were a few instances where he had something that seemed a little bit more cartoony, and we kind of flip flopped back into the onomatopoeic category. It, as far as how he's using them in Japanese, I mean, is that part of your consideration? Like, okay, this is a sound that could apply to a car or a, you know,
I guess so. I mean, sometimes I go back and forth, and if it's the same sound in Japanese or something very similar being applied to a totally different object in Japanese,
mm,
maybe try to find. Sometimes go back and try to find something that works for both of them in
right.
a way, just to kind of keep that. What's the right word for it?
Conceptual unity.
Yeah, conceptual unity. Yeah, that kind of like imaginative ambiguity that sometimes some of the
Mhm.
sound effects have, right? So I think there is like most of the sound effects that he uses, they are not very creative, and I'm not saying this in a negative way. They're like very stock sound effects used in Japanese comics. They're at the level of like Biff Bam Pow kind of stuff.
Right.
So, but he makes them interesting by like repeating them, and also in combination with a set of graphics that themselves are very abstract.
Mhm.
So I think it's like him using sound effects that are gigantic, but also very familiar. Probably helps in different ways to kind of root and ground a work that is otherwise highly abstract, at least for Japanese readers, right? I also started thinking it's like I know this is not I think like people who read Yokoyama books, I don't think they're going in translation, even in Japanese. I don't think you're going in and necessarily reading every sound effect every time you look at a panel, right? So in that sense, it's not definitely necessary to kind of make the translated sound effects as big as they are in Japanese.
Right.
Right. I think obviously most of the visual pleasure of Yokoyama's works comes out of looking at the images, not necessarily sounding out the sounds for yourself, which itself also has a kind of a different kind of pleasure. But yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think there's like different things you can say about. I mean, Glacier Bay Books, which is a small publisher out of Oregon, well, they're moving now. I think he's moving now to Winnipeg, but out of Oregon. So they have a short Yokoyama work in their forthcoming Glaolia anthology, #3. And he had all the sound effects redrawn by a relettered, right? And it was doable, because I think the work was quite short, maybe 10 to 20 pages. And I saw a sample, he did a very good job. But, to do that for an entire, how long is Plaza? 200, 300 page book?
Right.
It's just, it's way too, it'd be so much work. You'd really have to, it costs a lot of money, take a lot of time. And unless you're absolutely sure you can do it perfectly and in a way that makes the artist happy, it's just too much risk,
Yeah,
So-
and you butt up against reading direction issues where
Sure.
the dominant
Yeah.
of your eye from left to right while reading the sound effect is in opposition to the dominant strain of the panel. Yeah, and I can't imagine it, but Carson and I have talked about this a lot. Like, unless you have an artist who has the same finesse as the original ones. I mean, when you've got lovely hand drawn sound effects, even if they're produced with templates or whatever. I mean, why, why, like you said, why take the risk that you're going to be able to match the quality of it?
But to one thing you're saying though, Yokoyama sound effects, they're all, from what I remember, especially all these, they're all horizontal and they all go left to right.
Interesting.
So in Japanese. So in terms of directionality, that itself wouldn't be a problem for English.
Okay.
Because already in the Japanese, the sound effects, I mean, this one's hard to tell because it's the same letter over and over again. Do, 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 do. Doesn't really matter if you read it from right to left or left to right.
Right.
And most of his sound effects are repeating, but other ones are definitely left to right. So it's the same orientation as it would have to be in English.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
But it's not just about directionality or could you mimic the style. Like they're just part of the composition. So I can't see someone else being able to come in and carve up this negative space and this negative space and this negative space with an American word and preserve the integrity of what he's doing compositionally, like with the sharpness here. And that to me, like, I don't even think I need to see the brum and the spop and the dong. For me, the pleasure of his work is the way the shapes fit together. And I just know there's noise going on, and it's the compositions. I'd be so scared to mess with that.
Yeah. I feel the same way. But like lettering practices and for translated localized manga has really changed in the past few years. And there was a time back in the day where people took a lot of time to like read letter sound effects, and they did a good job. And then there was kind of an era when everyone was kind of using boilerplate fonts to do that. But recently, again, you have a lot of really talented letterers working for the big publishing houses, Viz and Kodansha, particularly. Viz in particular is really good at this. Their publications. So, and when they receive, for the most part, from what I understand, when they receive the artwork from the Japanese publishers, all those sound effects they're baked into the image, right? So they have to go in and Photoshop or whatever they do out. They have to get rid of all that stuff and redraw it. And of course, it's not quite at the level of Yokoyama, at least not for an entire book. But, shonen manga, boys manga, there's a lot of action scenes. That manga with a lot of action scenes also have lots of sound effects in there. They're so integrated with the artwork that they actually kind of oftentimes like move behind characters or between characters, right? Yeah. So there is an expectation now that if you're going to be a serious letterer and you are going to have to redo those kind of sound effects in a very kind of excruciating handicraft way, right? And people have gotten very good about it. There's some really amazing, stuff out there. Titles like Chainsaw Man from Viz Media. It's like really great, lettering decisions are being done. So, I wonder now what the lettering community now would think about decisions. You know, if anybody thinks that like a Yokoyama work should be relettered by hand from front to back. But I know for me personally, I mean, granted, you know, I read Japanese, so it doesn't bother me for other reasons. But, you know, I think it's his drawing style, his comic style is so much about also how the sound effects are drawn into the image.
Right.
So for me, it seems perhaps a transgression against his aesthetic to go in and do that.
Right, and everything that he's done is very singular, you know, in terms of, you know, there being a discrete beginning and ending, and like a sort of conceptual unit that encompasses the entire book. I think that's the thing that, you know, really like sold me on Plaza as an entire work, was not just like the first encounter with it and like, oh, this is interesting or this is challenging or whatever. It's the entirety of the experience. You have a conceptual unity to it that carries through from the first page to the last page.
Sure.
And I think that that's you know, that's the thing that to me makes this a sort of more international flavor of a book than a lot of things that, you know, have made it over. You know, I mean, not to like dive into futurism or something, but, you know, that's my major reference for Yokoyama is the futurist painters.
Sure.
And it almost seems to me like he's somebody who's got a really concrete vision of how time works, studied a bunch of futurism, and like wanted to see what it was like to take like a, you know, a futurist painting of a rocket ship and turn it into a 300-page
Sure.
book.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't talked to him about his art, his historical reference points in a long time, but I had asked him a long time ago about the futurism stuff, and he, you know, denied being any kind of direct influence.
Really?
From them.
Wow.
You know, I mean, he was interested in the 1990s, so he, you know, he was, I can't remember the actual dates, but he went to art school, I think, in the 1990s. So he was originally a painter and kind of doing these blocky, very vibrantly colored abstractions.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and one thing that he was interested in was into playing video games. So perhaps some of his graphics come out of some of his notions of abstraction and how he structures narratives. Maybe can be related to how video games are structured in different ways. Kind of like a scrolling effect or certain types of abstraction, or, you know, emphasis on pure repeating sound and action over any kind of narrative development, so to speak. So yeah, he was also interested, I think, to some degree in visionary architecture, avant-garde architecture. And there's some very clear references to that in some of his early works. But yeah, that's always been his. But, you know, in the interview that we're including in the back of Plaza, no, is this not? This is not. He talks a little bit about art historical references there, but there's another interview I saw online recently in which he talks about that he really liked baseball manga when he's growing up. And baseball manga, you know, they go on for hundreds or thousands of pages. A lot of times, extended gameplay, right? So it's just bats cracking and pitches being thrown and crowds cheering, right? Not unlike in Plaza. And oftentimes, if you compare, I did a one or two posts on Instagram with this, but if you compare some big baseball manga from the time when he was a kid in the 1970s with some of his pages, you can definitely see how his manga are influenced by kind of the painful yet dramatic, boring yet dramatic repetition of sports play in sports manga.
Right. What's the name of the one that follows the boy in his training? And his father builds him all these apparatuses. Something Star.
Star of the Giants, Kyojin no Hoshi. So that's from the 60s. But the one that he was, even bigger one, is called Dokaben. It's the name of the character, by an author named Mizushima Shinji, who died recently last year. But in the 70s, that was the big baseball manga. The characters were much more personable than Star of the Giants. It went on for much longer. It was big on TV, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, he references that manga a bit in some interviews.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, the sound effects comparison that you did was really interesting too. Yeah, that interview that we've got in the back of Plaza, which was done with like an arts magazine, one of the details that was really intriguing to me was saying he says essentially that the pacing throughout Plaza, that he imagined it as being fairly static from panel to panel. I think he estimates 4 seconds.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, which is really fascinating to me, that this is like so diagrammatic for him, that he's got like a pulse unit in his head when he's building building the name, what do you call it, like the layouts, like do you get the sense that, I mean, you've met him, right? You were at the
I've met him quite a few times, yeah.
So you were at the gallery opening for
for the original Japanese edition. Yeah, I went to the opening. It was quite cool. I mean, he signed books, but also he had decorated the walls with sound effects. And if I'm not mistaken, he does. The reason that some of his sound effects look exactly the same is because he like writes them out in pencil or marker, and then uses a light table to trace them onto the finished page. Right. So I think those templates, those rough templates that he used for the sound effects, that's what he had pasted all over the walls. And in the past too, other openings he's had, I don't know if he still does this, he would also kind of like compose and recompose pages by drawing individual panels on little scraps of paper and then tracing those onto a page. So he used to like kind of hand those out at shows back in the day, back 10 years ago. I think they're probably worth too much now for him to do that. He knows he can sell them instead. But yeah.
I thought it was maybe they weren't were they stencils, like
no.
Okay, yeah, so they're just like light tabled. Okay.
Yeah. He just does it on some kind of cheap paper, and then puts the drawing paper on top of them, sandwiches them in between the light table and the piece of paper, and traces them in. I think.
You said that the sound effects that he's using are very stock sound effects that he doesn't. That seems to me like that. The first time I encountered his work, not being able to read it or even barely know what I'm looking at first till my eyes adjust, I felt like that's what I was looking at, is everything stock that makes manga, like distilled into its like most insane, like the action and the sound effects. So it's interesting to hear that he's picking the stock sound effects.
Yeah. I mean, they're even more stock in the sense that, Japanese language, just everyday speech, uses a lot of onomatopoeic words. So like that goro 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 you were looking at, the rolling sounds. I mean, in Japanese, you can say in a sentence, I spent the day goro goroing in my room, which means I spent the day just lying around, rolling around on the floor in my room, right, doing nothing. It means I spent the day in bed, basically, or lying around on the floor on the couch, right? So it's like these are not just sound effects and not just onomatopoeia, but because onomatopoeia is used quite commonly in Japanese speech, they're also words.
Right. Yeah, it's a very interesting distinction. It was interesting too to take a look at the French edition, and I don't often get a chance to see 3 different versions of something at the same time, and see how the translation was handled there, and radically different, because it has a much more like what would you call percussive effect, because they just pop in one little thing, like, okay, here it is.
Oh, I see.
Here's like what one little unit of this means. But
really?
Yeah. And like you were pointing out to me in our discussion, well, it's not one, it's 15 in a row, and here's 7 in a row. And
I think you have to at least give the sense of the repetition, and not just the repetition, but kind of like the lack of pause. I think this is something we talked about, right? Rather than going goro, 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 like have it goro, goro. You know, make it understood that it's kind of a repeating, nonstop repeating sound,
Right.
which is how it reads visually, also. You know.
Yeah, and thematically, what's happening in the book? We could just I can't believe that we've been talking for an hour and I haven't mentioned the fact that the book is a parade, uh,
Okay.
and each part of the each page of the book is essentially like a sequence in the parade, and we have like this celebration of something that we're not actually sort of acknowledged until very later in the book, and yeah, it's unrelenting. I noted with interest one of the first reviews, a little preview went up at a few channels, and one of the first reviews on Goodreads was a person who gave it 5 out of 5 stars, but was also totally exasperated and said that they read 10 or 15 pages at a time uh, because they had to stop. They were afraid they were going to get a headache or their brain was going to come out of their ears.
Sure.
And I totally get it because it's like this, you're seeing this like kinetic experience on paper, and it can be a little bit like sort of discomforting
Yeah.
at first.
Sure.
Um,
I mean, because well, you mentioned a French edition,
yeah.
and here's a kind of a side anecdote. I mean, also finishing up a long delayed other Yokoyama book with Breakdown Press right now called Baby Boom. Right, it's kind of been in the works for many years, and for various reasons, it's only now finally being finalized. But what's interesting there is that so this also already exists in French, Baby Boom, and the original plan, for details I won't get, for reasons I won't get into, was to use the French edition, the artwork, the data from the French edition
Sure.
as is, with the French sound effects already in there. Because there was a belief amongst certain people that the French sound effects, it didn't really matter, right? What was important was the Japanese and how beautiful Yokoyama's work was. And that as long as you could read something in alphabet, it all was the same, It's just like, but going, then we really like went into it and like really started thinking about some of the sound, how some of the renderings in alphabet from the French translator, and they didn't really work for an English language reader, right? There's a lot more. I mean, I don't speak French, but it's kind of like a stereotypical thing. It's like there's a lot more O's and U's and I's, right? Oui's or something, right? And it just kind of like didn't work in English. So finally, the decision and the process we're going through now is kind of de-Frenchifying a lot of the sound effects. But it's really difficult, and there was hesitancy to do this, partly because that's a multicolor work. So they're in the sound effects themselves are in color, in multiple colors. So it's been really, really tedious to kind of like redo that, right?
Right.
So, yeah.
I definitely want to see his work in color.
Oh,
That
the
has to be
baby boom is a really beautiful work. It's kind of it's like Plaza impresses on like giant scale and pure repetition and pure volume,
Right.
I think. But like Baby Boom is much more intricate. Each kind of chapter is like its own 2-page or 6-page little narrative. But like it's multiple colors, and it has its kind of own exquisite beauty in a different way. Yeah. So this will be coming out from Breakdown Press, hopefully by the end of the year.
Gotcha.
That's intense.
Need to be good comparisons,
Yeah.
or good companions to each other. Let's say.
Yeah.
Well, I fear that half the things that I want to ask you about Ryan are things that we shouldn't talk about on camera.
Oh, go ahead.
Like no, you
can delete it.
Your list of 20 comics, I think that at least a few of those are things that both of us would be salivating over at the same time. Do you? Let me ask a slightly more general thing. It seems to me that the disregard for the past of comics is a fairly universal phenomenon when you compare it to the way that film studios have maintained their assets and things like that. Do you have any insight as to why that might be? Is it purely a financial thing? Do you think that
In Japan or
yeah, sure.
wherever.
I mean, in the United States, it seems like it's just because there's no regard for it as an art
Sure.
form.
I
Uh,
mean, like I'll speak more of Japan because I understand the situation a
yeah,
little bit there better. But like, comics, like most pop culture, whether we call comics pop culture or not, set that aside, right? It's like a large part of it's pop culture, right? So like most pop culture, it has a shelf life,
mhm.
right? It's like you're most familiar, you most identify with the things that you grow up on, right? For me, it would be like manga from the 1980s, like Dragon Ball or Fist of the North Star, right? That will always be kind of like a ground zero for me for manga, like what manga is. And it's like everything before that is old in a way. And like especially I'm a historian, so I have a different view of this now. Like for people who aren't into like the history of the medium, who love the medium but aren't into the history of the medium, if you're younger, it's like the 1980s are old, right? The 1990s are a long time ago. So in Japan, there's with all pop culture, I think there's that thing going on that there's like a one generation memory of the history of a medium or a two generation memory. It's like what I read and what my parents read. But in Japanese case, it's like Tezuka Osamu, when he came out in the late 1940s after World War II, he was so big and things changed so much because of him that baby boomer generation in Japan basically just blotted out everything that happened before him, right? So all the histories, most of the histories in Japan about manga more or less begin with Tezuka in the late 1940s. And there's a couple titles from the pre-World War II period that are known, but it's very vague history. And even the historiography of early manga is not well done in Japan. It's very spotty, right? There's not a whole lot of kind of reprints of old stuff. The history is very piecemeal. People make real big jumps about saying things. And part of this is that there's not really a market for writing about older comics in Japan. It's like people who are professional critics and they might do some editing on the side. Like they can make some money writing about Tezuka and things that happened after Tezuka, but it's much harder to do so about the pre-1945 period. And the archives are different, collections are scattered, and also just haven't been Japanese scholars just don't have the same kind of institutional support, say, that historians and scholars do in other countries. So it just hasn't never really gelled, and I think it's changing now. There's a number of scholars in Japan who are working on the pre-1945 period more seriously. In English, there's Ike Exner, who did the book Comics and the what was it called? Comics and the Origins of Manga that came out this past year, and he's doing really fantastic and very kind of groundbreaking and fundamental work about the history of early manga. And there's a number of scholars in Japan too who are kind of re-looking at that history, but it's taken a lot of time. So I just think between like manga status, comic status is pop culture. It means that it's seen a lot of people, but I think it also means that the history is forgotten very quickly within a generation or two. But also just comics, say, unlike other media, visual media, just haven't had the same kind of institutional support either for reprints or for serious historical research.
Yeah, to your point about the history being forgotten, it was really intriguing to me. I believe there was a small entry in your book, the Translator Without Talent, about getting pushback on an assertion that you had made that Tezuka was influenced by Floyd Gottfredson, which is just so obvious to anybody who's ever held a pen.
Sure.
And yet that was a difficult thing. I mean, isn't it like a documented phenomenon
Well,
that
that was more. I think with Tezuka's case, I mean, the history of manga is more about what's the right way. The history of manga's relationship to non-Japanese comics has been immensely understudied, right? There is an assumption and there's knowledge that, yes, Japanese artists, especially after World War II, were influenced by Hollywood, by movies, and then, also animation, particularly Disney. So it's always about kind of influences from another medium, right? So about influence from film, whether it be live action or animated film. That's how it's always been told. There is recognition that here and there that American comics have come into Japan or come to into the consciousness of Japanese artists and therefore influence the history of Japanese comics. But the historical research on that until recently has been quite thin, right? It's like when I started the 10-cent manga project, and the first one I did was the Sugiura and the Mohicans. And I tried to track down all the American Western comics and also the Tarzan issues he was knocking off. No one had done that really, only a tiny bit in Japanese, right? And since then, people have looked at Mizuki Shigeru's work, Mizuki, and found not just the dozens of American horror comics he has completely ripped off, but also all the photographs from photo magazines that he has copied, and then the history goes way back. It's like you can't tell the history of manga going back to late 19th century, but talking about the impact of American comics and cartoons, right? It's just, once you see that, you can't unsee it. But until recently, no one's really bothered to kind of do the nitty-gritty research of showing this is connected to this, in this way, this panel is connected to this comic in this stylistic way.
Right, because I suppose it's a different thing saying this is obvious to my eye,
Right.
versus here's the panel. Look,
Right.
he had this from a GI or whatever gave him. I mean, you don't have you can
Sure.
imagine the story once you have the specifics. But you're right, it's a different kind of thing versus a supposition.
I mean, everybody in Japan, everybody knows that after World War II, there was the occupation, and that American soldiers, particularly American soldiers, were in Japan, and that it's also known amongst people who know about manga that they brought American comics with them, right? But it's kind of understood that that's the moment it starts. 1945, it starts, right? All of a sudden, the Americans are in Japan in large numbers, and because of them, they're influencing. Because of this, their reading material of kitty comics, they're influencing people like Tezuka and other people. But no one took the time either to do the nitty-gritty research of what exactly was influencing who. There's this kind of assumption in some ways that it ends with the end of the occupation in 1952, but it doesn't, because American bases are still in Japan. The Korean War is staged completely out of Japan. Vietnam War also staged largely out of Japan. So these patterns, kind of stay. There's also a prehistory to it, that different editors and artists also went to America in the pre-World War II period, that they had their hands on different types of American comics and strips. So, the influence predates 1945, which complicates for people of a more nationalistic mindset that the manga is sui generis, a Japanese thing, where it's obviously not. It's like it defies common sense, right? That it's like every other medium in the history of the modern period. They're all integrated, right? It's kind of an international, kind of globalizing era, right? Yeah. It's like you would never say that Japanese modern literature, film, whatever it might be, painting, sculpture, we've recognized for decades that they have local aspects in the same way that they have ways that they're influenced from other countries. But for some reason, the history of manga has not been told recognizing that blatant and obvious fact.
Well, and artists are by nature just like hungry, voracious consumers and curious. And so it's very hard for me to imagine that the artists over there aren't just like getting a hold of whatever they can, just in the same way we would. Totally. Do you have a sense of like what the contemporary landscape is in terms of them looking at what's going on here contemporary, or are we pretty irrelevant?
I don't know. A lot of American comics, superhero stuff gets translated into Japanese. There's also been there's been a bigger boom in the past 10 years in French and Belgian stuff getting translated into Japanese. So I can't name any names, but because I don't know who they are. But I imagine you would find a lot more artists these days in the past 10 or 20 years, younger artists, who were more strongly influenced by Francophone comics than they were by American comics. You already see, even going back to the 1960s, people like Baron Yoshimoto, they knew about, Francophone comics, and they were being influenced by them in different ways. But I think it kind of like, it's really kind of taken off mainly, and it hasn't been documented or analyzed, particularly in the past 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, well, we were both remarking on the Baron Yoshimoto collection that you put out, the sample images in the back during your essay, the ones that he did in conjunction with another artist that were intended to look
Right.
as American as possible,
Yeah,
and how much he draws on like Stan Drake and
sure.
that sort of, like mid 50s American, popular style. It's really, not only is it fantastic work when you see him working in sort of his like slightly less derivative style. I think it's really amazing, but it's also just to see the cross pollination, and it's really something else. I mean, you would think if you didn't read that essay and hadn't seen his stuff that just wasn't something that happened, but of course
Right.
it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
Well, Sean, I think you said like you can see it with your eyes as someone who knows what it is. Like me and you both looked at it and said, I know those marks.
Right.
Like I know the lineage of those marks and stuff. But if you don't have the, like you said, the proof for it also, then it's just speculation. But it was so obvious to us looking at that. We're like, oh yeah, there, because with Strange Death, we had spent so much time looking at that lineage that it's just immediately obvious.
But Japanese, there's also kind of like a slight anxiety about admitting too much influence, right? Because there's this kind of thing where it's like, oh, you point out that ex-Japanese artist took Y from this American artist. And it's particularly with the big artists, there's a lot of defensiveness amongst Japanese fans saying, well, are you saying that he just knocked off your American culture? It's like, no, it's not what I'm saying, right? But you have to kind of like navigate that first of all.
Hmm.
But some Japanese artists, Tezuka he was interviewed a lot, he wrote a lot, so Tezuka was actually, this is a generalization, I think he was probably more honest about his non-Japanese influences than he was about ways that he was influenced by his peers in Japan. He had a massive ego, and he did not hesitate to crush and put down younger upstarts that were threatening his preeminence in the fields, right? And also even deny the role of his collaborators, like Sakai Shichima, who he collaborated with New Treasure Island, his breakout work, right? He went as far as in the 1980s, redrawing the whole work with his own hand and stating that this was what it should have been, and that Sakai guy ruined it. And it's obviously a lesser work and a different work, and it's just a lie, right? So, but he stated many times over the different types of American comics and movies and animation that he has been interested, also non-American stuff.
Yeah,
because other artists have not been so honest, like Saito Takao, the guy who did Go-Go 13, right? He is like, we would not in outside of Japan, we would not see him as the most interesting or important Gekiga artist. But in Japan, he is the artist most associated with the word Gekiga because he kind of took that style and was the first one to really get big with it in the mainstream magazine market.
Right.
But in his autobiographies, he said, when I was young, I saw Batman comics that the American soldiers brought over. But after that, absolutely no influence on my work. But if you look at his work from the 1960s, Go-Go 13, it's very obvious that even though how he draws like jaw lines, that in paneling and everything, that he's obviously looking at American comics. But I met him 10 years ago and asked him this point blank. He was like, nope, never heard of it, never looked at American comic ever again after I was a child. And it's just like, I know you're lying, but I can't tell you that, and you're lying. So I mean, whatever. He's also like he was a major artist. He's dead now, died last year, but he's a major artist. He was probably interviewed 100 times about his life. So at some point, I think he got, you repeat a certain story that works for the media, and then you end up believing your own story, right? You like forget the other details that don't fit into that self hagiography. So, I think he was lying, but I also think like he probably forgot at some point that he was lying.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I've interviewed a lot of people and past lives, and penetrating the sort of the prepared anecdote is almost impossible unless you do something rather extraordinary. Somebody who's told the same story even as little as like 5 or 6 times, you get locked into the contour of it.
Sure.
You really have to do something like bring somebody to the location or bring him an object or have him smell something or read a letter. I can only imagine what it would be like to be like he was at the peak of the hill, and he had how many people worked for the Saito Enterprise? It was like 24.
Maybe, something like that.
That's got to do something to you in terms of your ability to reconnect to your formative experiences and
Sure. Now, when I went to Saito Pro, that was about 10 years ago. Like I got a tour of the workshop floor. It was much smaller then. I think he had about 6 people, five or six people doing drawing stuff for him. But man, it looked miserable. The lighting was bad, like horrible fluorescent blue lights, really crammed. And like I remember this guy, he was probably like in his 40s, and he was like cutting out things to paste onto the page and then using a blow dryer to like dry the glue fast. It was like very like hands-on, but in a very like backward way. I don't know. Yeah.
If anybody's interested in seeing the Saito Pro actually oversaw, as far as I know, was one of the first manga in English that was of any sizable length. I used to have a copy of it. God knows what I did with it. They put out a Go-Go 13. They established a name to release it under in the United States. It was another one of those like sort of trial balloon things.
Right.
It has the honor of being probably the worst translation and lettering I've ever seen. It's mechanically lettered. I mean, presumably that's just the way they saw it, but a very interesting like single volume Go-Go 13 that came out in like 1984 or something like that. Anyway, not that this has anything to do with our discussion. It's just an interesting little.
Well, a while back, to bring it back to Yokoyama, the other manga artists. There's a couple manga artists, only a few that he's like clearly said I was interested in this and I read it as a kid and it influenced me. Usually his shtick is no, I never read manga. I don't care. My work comes out of it myself. But one would be later. All this stuff has come out like 10 years later in his career. So one would be sports baseball manga. One would be gag manga, Akatsuka Fujio and other people who did like slapstick humor. And then the third one is, he said, like works like Iceland. I don't know if you remember that work that came out from Retrofit Comics. And what were the other ones? World Map Room, which was one of the last ones that came out from Picture Box. He said, I wanted to do kind of hyper gekiga, neo gekiga. Like I looked at Saito Takao and I wanted to do that with all men and all sound and all action,
Wow.
So it's like, some of those works, I don't think you can't say this for Plaza. I think Plaza is much closer to sports manga,
right,
and how it's structured, or maybe video games and kind of a scrolling structure, like I said before. But I think for some of those middle works that came out after Travel and Garden, like World Map Room, Iceland, what else? I think those are the works that he started talking about, and like Museum World started talking about as neo gekiga. And if you like compare them to kind of the more cinematic, melodramatically dramatic moments in something like Go-Go 13, the very macho things, you can kind of see what he was trying to do.
Sure, especially when you get those like 5-page sequences of like a helicopter flying in, and then you see the guy lifting the gun sight to his eye or whatever, and every panel has its own. It's got back to that like pacing where all of a sudden where it got this sort of more cinematic, like rolled out quality to it. I could totally see that. It's a very interesting. Well, mean, Ryan, thanks for taking the time to talk to us and for being so candid and open about all these things. Um, I hope that everybody who is watching this, who has made this so far, will take a look at the Plaza campaign. And if you are interested in this totally singular work, this is a very, very unusual book, and I think a seminal exploratory work
Yeah.
of comics. Do you want to say anything else about this particular book, or anything else about why people should pick it up?
I'll say two things. I mean, um, I know some people, long time Yokoyama fans, for whom this is the best book,
Mm.
that they've seen. They I think if you're a Yokoyama fan of a certain sort, you like, well, why is he even bother drawing narratives or like semi stories at all? It's just like, let's just do a work of pure action and abstraction for 200, 300 pages. So I think that this is like a more closer realization of that
Hmm.
for a certain kind of purist Yokoyama fan. So I know, and it's also dimensionally the largest black and white work he has done.
Right.
So I think for many Yokoyama fans, this will kind of be in some way, kind of the epitome of what they thought he was always heading towards in some ways.
Yeah.
The other thing for me, and I think this will also be interest to many Yokoyama fans, is that we translated not just Yokoyama's own afterword to the Japanese edition, but also an interview that he did with a Japanese arts magazine at the time he was drawing Plaza. And it is by far the most revealing interview that Yokoyama has done. Yokoyama has traditionally been very tight-mouthed with the media and really not responsive to interviewers, giving very flat yes or no and dismissive answers. Or statements of the obvious. But here he like really opens up and like really talks about what he was trying to do, other things he was thinking about, and it really makes him seem like much more of a human than one of the robots inside of his manga.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if he's just, they had an existing relationship or what, but he's just, really, you get a sense of him as a person and
Yeah.
his day-to-day life. It's a really excellent interview. I'm really glad that you found that, and I'm really glad that you got permission to translate it too. I think people are really going to enjoy it. Carson, you got a pitch here for us?
Yeah, I do absolutely. Because I'm coming at it from the total outsider perspective when I look at his work. And I think as someone who's not yet a Yokoyama Yuichi fan, like you can learn so much about what lies underneath the imagery. Even though the imagery here is still obvious and translatable, the first thing I saw when I looked at his work was like, if I'm teaching a class on 2D design principles and I purposely make my students work without imagery, and I just work with shape, work with rhythm, work with all of those principles. And I think that's what I was saying. He's taken, like you're saying, he's using stock lettering, and he's kind of using like what I consider stock of manga and then turning those into basic principles and composing on them. And I think there's so much to learn from his work about page layout, about rhythm, motion in comics in its more abstract form that is there in other works, but maybe covered over by the content. He's exposing the form more in a really compelling way. Like the form comes first and the content's subverted to that. And so I think anyone who really cares about the medium of comics and how they work and the design and art aspect, like you should be studying his work. He's doing something, really essential to in my mind. So that's my pitch, for the non-fans, is you're going to learn something about how comics work and how design and art works just by looking at his stuff.
Yeah. So the book will be out in September. You can pre-order now with our Kickstarter, and we have 200 copies of books that are signed and sketched by Yokoyama. And once those are gone, they are gone. If we have a few left after the campaign, they'll be on sale in the Living Line books, and you can also pre-order it from your local comic store or your local bookstore, and we hope that you will do so. Thanks so much for talking to us, Ryan. Really appreciate you.
Thank you.
I know you're a busy man. Thanks for making the time.
It was fun. Thank you.
Yeah,
Excellent.
appreciate it.
Take care.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.